In fact, I think if you ask the average person at Indiana University what our role is in feeding the world, the answer you would hear is, that's not our job. We think about feeding the world, but we don't actually feed anybody. So I think I'll take this role as the ringer and run with it a little bit. And I want to start by relating something that I learned in an unexpected place. I thought I knew something about the role of the university in feeding the world. Although I'm now at a non-land-grant institution, Indiana University, I have worked at land-grant colleges. I've spent several years at New Mexico State. I was out of academia and I worked as a consumer of agricultural knowledge for the U.S. Agency for International Development. I spent several years doing applied research with the Energy and Resources Group at Berkeley. So I always chafe at this kind of non-applied side of my own university. Nevertheless, it wasn't until last year that I really thought more about the general relationship of all universities to rural life. And this was while I was setting up a farm internship program for our liberal arts students to go and spend 6 to 8 weeks during the summer working on a real farm in Indiana. And I think the whole notion that the land-grant colleges are founded on, which is economies of scale, improved technology, and more efficiency so that you can cut down the amount of labor per acre. If you look at what the effects of that technology is, it's to remove people from the land. And unfortunately, it's hard to get across to a lot of development economic types that our problem in a place like Belize is not getting more people off the land and getting them to move to the city because there are no jobs for them in the city. And if we get them off the farm, they're just going to go to the United States and get jobs and join the ranks of our illegal aliens. As most of the people that used to farm in most of the villages where I've worked, well, most of them are in Chicago now, taking care of our elderly. So getting prices really low and squeezing the maximum amount per hour of labor is a very good program for getting people off the land. And I think that we have to kind of own up to the fact that the university plays a central role in doing that. Now, second, I want to talk about Cartesian dualism, because the state of Indiana, where I live, has a university which could have been designed by the hand of Descartes. The head is in Bloomington and the hands are at Purdue. And the people at Purdue are supposed to do practical things with their hands, and they're supposed to be concerned about the real world, and their buildings are built out of cinder block, and they have linoleum on the floor. And in Bloomington, we're supposed to be thinking high thoughts, and we're supposed to be artistic, and we're supposed to be doing abstract kinds of science, and developing pure knowledge, and not getting our hands dirty if we don't even have hands. And there's this kind of politics of knowledge that, and of course our buildings are made out of limestone and we have wood paneling and wood floors. So we have a lot of cultural capital and we don't get paid as much as they get paid at Purdue. They have more economic capital, to use Bourdieu's terminology. And then we reproduce those same divisions in the university, where the practical schools get the crummy buildings and have low status, so the School of Health, Physical Education, and Recreation is kind of stuck around the pool in a bunch of overheated rooms, And the math department, where they think a lot of high thoughts, has walnut paneling and coffered ceilings and oil paintings of famous mathematicians. So here we are at Indiana University trying to put together a food studies program. Oh, I should mention, in Indiana there was a serious problem with the medical school. Because, yeah, medicine is done with the hands, but you sure do want a head attached to those hands before you're going to let them take your body apart. But they couldn't decide where to put the medical school, whether it was head or hand, so they put it halfway in between in Indianapolis. And that's where they put the law school, too, because, you know, who knows what lawyers are. Definitely doing something practical, but they're doing it with their mouths, so they've got to be in Indianapolis. The vet school, Purdue could have the vet school, but and even at IU, the School of Optometry isn't on campus. It's kind of across a busy intersection where people get run over trying to walk between the two parts of campus.
Especially if they don't have good eyes.
So there are some, so here at IU we have a food studies program. At Purdue they have the Center for Ingestive Science. And we both claim to be multidisciplinary. I've actually been invited to the ingestion place to give a talk next year. But it is pretty much dominated by people who work in food science and whose goal is to get people to eat more of something and not necessarily to think about why. Whereas we don't really have very many people interested in getting anybody to do anything, but we ask why every single day. And I think in some ways it's a kind of a blessing that we are far from the agro-industrial complex and we have no funding. Because we're not really beholden to anybody, and we have political scientists, people in media and communications, English, anthropology, history, geography, folklore, ethics, the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, biology, nutrition, and human biology. And there is a little garden on campus. So we can actually go up there and see plants now and then and pick some food. But it's a very different approach to thinking about food and feeding the world from the kind of approach we would have if we were at a land-grant school. I will just speak very, very briefly on my fourth point, and that is what I call topical butchery. And that is that if you look around the university, any university, and you ask who's responsible for food, it's like going to the federal government and saying who's responsible for food. Because there's 1,000 agencies responsible for food or have something to do with food. We don't study food. We divide the study of food up into as many pieces as we divide an animal up into before it goes to the supermarket. And we hand them off to specialists, each of whom becomes extremely good, and you know the saying, knowing more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. And it's a parody because we never really get to that point of knowing everything about nothing, but we, in the process, have developed an approach to food that is so fragmented across disciplines and across so many different paradigms of human nature and ways of thinking about issues like choice and ways of thinking about the difference between individuals and social units, that when we get together to talk about food, we can have a common conversation as long as we stick to the food. But as soon as we start talking about humans, it turns out that the economist thinks that humans are individuals acting as rational actors, and the sociologist thinks that they belong to groups. And they act as in the interest of groups, and the anthropologist believes in all of them at the same time. We actually reproduce these same divisions within my own discipline. So we have economic anthropologists, and we have ecological anthropologists, and then we have the biological anthropologists and the nutritional anthropologists. And we have exactly the same kinds of problems talking to each other, which usually makes anthropology departments very fractious places. The one thing that has held my department together through some very difficult discussions and times has been the recognition that we are all interested in food. And that we can all relate what we do to food, and we try to keep our eyes focused on the food and not on the differences in our different paradigms. And I'm frustrated with the way, with disciplinarity. The disciplines were created in a different world. They were created in 19th century Germany. And the way that 19th century Germans divided the world up is not really functional in the 21st century. It just doesn't make any sense anymore. And, you know, I've got colleagues in geography who are doing exactly the same thing I'm doing, but they're referring to a completely different literature. Yeah. Which says almost exactly the same thing that our literature says.
I know.
And we even refer to some of the same French people. So we can even agree on what French people we want to cite, but we live in kind of two separate worlds.